Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a story buried so deep within the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that most people who love this universe have only ever caught the edges of it. They know the surface version. That the Emperor had a secret project. That Magnus the Red ruined it. And that this is why the Emperor now sits dying on the Golden Throne. They know the outline. But the outline is not the story. The story is something far older, far stranger, and far more heartbreaking than a few lines of summary could ever hope to capture. This is the story of what the Emperor actually found when he stepped into that dimension between dimensions. It is the story of what he was building, why he was building it in secret from even the people he trusted most, and what it would have meant for humanity if things had gone differently. It is the story of a civilization that understood the danger before anyone else did, and of a plan so ambitious and so quietly desperate that it staggers the imagination. And more than anything else, it is the story of how one moment, one single catastrophic, well-intentioned mistake, transformed the Emperor from the greatest architect of human destiny in history into a prisoner on a golden chair at the heart of a dying empire. A prisoner who has now been sitting there for 10,000 years. Listening to the screaming of demons on the other side of a door he has never been able to stop holding shut. Settle in. This is going to take a while to tell properly, and it absolutely deserves to be told properly. Before we go anywhere, it's worth taking a moment to really appreciate the kind of story this is. A lot of Warhammer 40,000 storytelling is, understandably, focused on the immediate and visceral, the armies, the battles, the titanic clashes of will and blade and bolter across the surfaces of worlds. And those stories are tremendous. The setting has produced some of the most compelling military fiction and dark fantasy in the history of the genre. But underneath all of that surface noise, underneath the spectacle of golden armor and corrupted flesh, and the grinding machinery of a civilization that has been at war for 10,000 years without cessation, there is something else, a quieter and more devastating story about what humanity was trying to become, and what it failed to become, and what it is slowly, painfully, perhaps terminally, losing the ability to even remember it was trying to become. The Emperor's Webway project is, in a very real sense, the heart of that quieter story. It is the thing the entire setting was built around. Every aspect of the 41st Millennium's particular flavor of horror. The daily deaths of thousands to sustain a wounded god. There's the terrifying fragility of interstellar communication across a galaxy split by a psychic wound. The institutional fear of psychers that warps and corrupts the very society that needs them. The constant grinding vulnerability to a dimension that wants everything humanity is. All of it connects back to this one failure. This one project that came so close to succeeding. This one moment when everything that might have been was replaced by everything that is. For understanding this is understanding something fundamental about why Warhammer 40,000 is not just grimdark for the sake of darkness. The darkness has a reason. The reason has a history. And the history begins not with the Horus heresy, not with the Emperor's rise to power, not even with the creation of the Primarchs, but with something that happened 60 million years before any human being had learned to walk upright. At Part 1, The Greatest Secret Never Told. To understand what the Emperor found in the Webway, you need to understand the scale of what he was actually trying to do. Not just politically, not just militarily, but cosmically. Because when you strip away the golden armor and the armies and the mythology, what the Emperor was attempting was something that had only been achieved twice before in the entire history of the galaxy. Once by a species of reptilian god beings who no longer existed, and once by a civilization that had burned itself to cinders in an orgy of psychic excess. He was trying to save humanity from the warp entirely, not just protect them from it, not just give them better tools for navigating it. He wanted to sever the relationship between the human species and the writhing psychic dimension that had been consuming souls and feeding the dark gods since long before humanity had even learned to walk upright. He wanted to cut that cord completely. To look at a galaxy where every psyker was a walking door to something hungry and terrible, where every journey between the stars required willingly diving into a sea of spiritual acid, and say, not anymore. We are going to build something else. We are going to build something better. The Webway was how he planned to do it. But before we can understand the Webway, before we can understand what the Emperor found inside it and why it changed everything, we have to go back, way back, and further back than the Horus Heresy, further back than the Great Crusade, further back even than humanity's own stumbling first steps into interstellar space. We have to go back roughly 60 million years to a time when the galaxy was ruled by beings so far beyond anything alive today that the word powerful barely registers as an adequate description. We have to go back to the old ones. The thing that makes Warhammer 40,000 so endlessly fascinating, and if you're willing to really dig into its foundations, is that almost nothing happening in the 41st millennium is actually new. Almost every conflict, every tragedy, every desperate gamble and cosmic mistake echoing through the modern setting, all of it has roots in events so ancient that the stars themselves have shifted since they occurred. The grimdark future is, in a very real sense, just an echo of a grimdark past that was so catastrophic it shattered the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Emperor understood this. That's part of what made him such a terrifying figure. He was old enough to have watched much of human history unfold personally. He had walked the earth as a nameless wanderer, guiding civilizations from behind the scenes, watching empires rise and fall, with the quiet patience of someone who understood that he had more important things to do with his time than rule. He was playing a game on a scale that no other human being could even conceptualize, against opponents that most humans couldn't perceive, for stakes that most humans couldn't comprehend. And somewhere along the way, he found the door, buried under the desert of what would become Asia, hidden beneath the sand and the silence. An artifact from a civilization that had come and gone before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from the trees. A psychic amplification device of staggering complexity, sitting dormant in the dark, waiting for someone with the intelligence and the power to understand what it was. The Emperor found it. He looked at it, and he understood. And in that moment of understanding, the shape of everything changed. But to know what he understood, we have to know the story of the thing the device opened the door into. We have to know the story of the Webway itself, and that story begins with the Old Ones. Part 2, Before the Beginning. The Old Ones and the birth of the Webway, 60 million years before the Horus Heresy. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 60 million years before the Civil War that broke the greatest empire humanity would ever build. There were beings walking this galaxy who regarded interstellar travel the way we regard walking to the kitchen. The distance between solar systems was not a problem for them. The vast, cold emptiness between stars was not an obstacle. They simply stepped through because they had built doors. The Old Ones were the first truly advanced spacefaring species in the galaxy's history. We don't know everything about them. What we know is fragmentary and filtered through 60 million years of myth and catastrophe and the unreliable memories of species that weren't even alive when the Old Ones were at their height. The Eldar, the Eldari, knew them. They were, in a very real sense, the children of the Old Ones, or at least their students and inheritors. And what the Eldari remember of their creators is something that strains the imagination. The Old Ones were patient in a way that felt geological, yet their wisdom was accumulated across timescales that would encompass the entire lifespan of a human civilization from hunter-gatherer tribes to fallen empire and back again, and still not scratch the surface of what they had seen and learned. They traveled the galaxy, they seeded worlds, they nurtured life, they crafted intelligence, they took struggling young species and gave them the gifts they needed to grow and flourish and become something worthy of the universe they inhabited. And at the heart of all of this, enabling all of it, was their greatest creation, the Webway. In physical terms, the Webway is a hyperdimensional construct that occupies the space between the material universe and the warp. It exists, as the old texts describe it, in both and in neither. It is not quite part of reality. It is not quite part of the psychic dimension. When it exists in a kind of liminal space that the old ones carved out from the membrane separating those two realms and then reinforced, structured, and protected with psychic engineering so advanced that even 60 million years later, after wars and disasters and the collapse of the civilizations that built it, most of it is still standing. Think about that. 60 million years of neglect, damage, conflict, and cosmic catastrophe, and the Webway is still mostly there. But the bones of it are still intact. The material it was built from, a substance sometimes called wraithbone by the Eldar who inherited and expanded it, is naturally resistant to the influence of the warp. It generates its own psychic shielding. It is, in the truest sense of the phrase, built to last. The network the old ones constructed spanned the entire galaxy. While it was a system of tunnels and passages, varying wildly in size. Some of them narrow enough that only an individual could walk through. Some of them so vast that entire fleets of warships could sail through their glowing corridors without touching the walls. Through this network, the old ones could step from one side of the galaxy to the other with something approaching instantaneous travel. They could be anywhere, at any time, without ever touching the dangerous, churning madness of the warp. The physical description of the Webway that comes through the sources is genuinely extraordinary to sit with. Imagine a dimension that is not quite material and not quite spiritual. A network of passages whose walls have a faint, inherent luminescence. Not brightness, not harshness, but the quiet glow of something that is alive in its own strange way, that has absorbed the psychic resonance of 60 million years of use and proximity to the boundary of the Imperium. But the air, if air is even the right word for what fills those spaces, has a different quality to it. Time moves differently in the Webway. Not in a way that is immediately dramatic, but in a way that accumulates over long journeys. The Eldar, who travel extensively through the Webway, have been known to age more slowly than those who do not. In some of the deeper, stranger sections of the network, time barely moves at all. So there are sections of the Webway so large that they contain their own weather systems. There are passages wide enough to accommodate vessels that would dwarf Imperial cruisers. There are chambers and open spaces within the network that contain abandoned structures from civilizations that no one alive today can identify. Things that were built and left in that in-between dimension before the Eldar existed, possibly before the old ones existed. From an era so remote that the very concept of memory as a vehicle for understanding it fails. The Webway is also, in principle, safe, not perfectly safe. In the current era, with the damage the fall inflicted on it, and the various incursions that have breached its walls over tens of thousands of years, significant portions of it are compromised or outright dangerous. But the fundamental principle of the Webway, that its walls are naturally resistant to the warp, as that the dimension it occupies insulates travelers from the entities and energies of the Imperium, means that traveling through it does not carry the existential risks that warp travel does. You do not need to encase your ship in Geller fields against demonic intrusion. You do not need a navigator with the rare mutation that allows them to perceive the tides of the Imperium. And you do not need to pray and hope and accept that a significant percentage of voyages will end in something worse than death. This was not just convenient. This was strategic. This was the difference between life and death for any civilization that understood what the warp actually was. The warp, the immaterium, the immaterial dimension that mirrors the inner lives of all sentient beings, had always been dangerous. Or long before the Chaos Gods achieved anything like their current coherence and power, the warp was home to predatory entities that fed on the psychic emanations of living minds. The Old Ones had learned early that the warp was a tool to be used carefully and a place to be passed through as briefly as possible. The Webway was their solution, their masterwork, their gift to themselves and, eventually, to the species they created. The Necrontyre first came into contact with the Old Ones in that era when the humanoid species was still crawling through space on sublight ships, spending millennia in stasis crypts just to reach neighboring stars. The contrast could not have been more stark. Beings who could step between worlds in an instant versus beings who needed to sleep away entire generations just to move between systems. The Necrontyre petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of immortality. They were refused. It was this refusal, combined with the searing jealousy of watching beings who were essentially gods move through space with casual ease, while the Necrontyre were trapped on their dying, irradiated worlds, that ignited the conflict that would eventually be called the War in Heaven. The Old Ones, with their mastery of the Webway, were nearly impossible to pin down in those early stages of the conflict. They could outmaneuver any enemy, they could reinforce any position. Yet they could appear and disappear across the galaxy with a speed that made conventional military strategy feel like trying to catch wind in your hands. The Necrontyre's superior technology was consistently outmaneuvered because the Old Ones didn't need to fight fair. They could be anywhere and nowhere, stepping through their dimensional network to respond to threats before the threats had properly materialized. It was only when the Necrontyre made their catastrophic bargain with the Citan, the star vampires, the star gods, entities of living energy who had been drifting through space since the earliest days of the universe, feeding on the radiation of stars before they were given physical form by the Necrontyre's desperate ingenuity, that the balance shifted. The Citan brought with them knowledge, and one of the things they brought was the knowledge of how to break into the Webway. The Citan, known as Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, had long desired to carry his eldritch fire into the Webway, working with the Necrons. For by then, the Necrontyre had sacrificed their organic bodies to receive the gift of immortality the Citan offered, becoming something cold and metallic and stripped of almost everything that had made them truly alive. He helped them construct what became known as the Dolmen Gates, living stone portals that could force an opening into the Webway's walls, as allowing entry that was not stable or controllable or pleasant, but was functional. The network itself could detect these intrusions and try to seal off compromised sections, the way a living body might try to isolate an infection. But the damage was done. The Old One's greatest advantage had been stripped away. The War in Heaven did not end cleanly. It did not end with a victor standing triumphant over a defeated enemy. It ended in catastrophe that consumed everyone involved. The Old Ones, desperate to counter the soulless killing machines of the Necron legions and the awful appetites of the Citan, began creating new species. Warrior races, psychically potent beings that could fight in ways that conventional soldiers could not. The Eldar, the Krork, who would eventually degenerate across millions of years into the Orcs, others whose names history has mostly lost. And in creating these psychically potent species, in flooding them with the power of the warp to make them weapons against enemies who were immune to conventional harm, the Old Ones inadvertently began feeding something far worse than the Citan. The psychic carnage of the war, the tidal waves of suffering and death and rage and fear pouring out of the billions of minds caught up in a galaxy-spanning conflict that lasted millions of years. All of that psychic energy was bleeding into the warp, coalescing, gathering, beginning to take shape. But the Chaos Gods, as they would eventually come to be known, were not born complete and fully formed in a single moment. They grew the way a storm grows, slowly, then all at once. And then the enslavers came, warp entities that could reach through the psychic connection of psychers and use their bodies as doorways to drag themselves into the material universe. They spread through the Old Ones' carefully cultivated younger races like a plague moves through a city with no immunity. The Old Ones, as already exhausted and battered by the War in Heaven, had no answer for this. Their civilization, which had endured for tens of millions of years, collapsed. They died, or fled, or became something else entirely. The exact fate of the Old Ones is one of the genuine mysteries of the setting. The Eldar myths say different things, And the truth, if there is a recoverable truth, is buried under 60 million years of silence. What they left behind was the Webway, still mostly intact, still spanning the galaxy, still functioning more or less, though damaged in ways that would never be fully repaired, and the knowledge of how to use it passed to the Eldar before the end came. The Eldar took what they had been given and built upon it. For millions of years, the Eldar civilization expanded through the Webway, using it to connect their worlds, to move their armies, and to conduct their commerce and their culture across distances that would be impossible to bridge through conventional space travel. They extended the existing network, added their own passages and gates, built cities within the Webway's larger arteries. They made it their own, in the way that a species sometimes inherits the tools of a greater civilization, and, through use and adaptation and the passage of time, comes to regard those tools as something they invented themselves. By the 18th millennium, in Terran reckoning, the Elder Empire had established Komorra as the primary trading hub within the Webway, an entire city constructed in the dimension between dimensions, growing without restraint, outside the jurisdiction of any Elder Council or governing body, a place where the rules that applied everywhere else did not apply, a place where excess and transgression and the pursuit of experience without limit could flourish. Komorra grew and kept growing, and in its growth and its permissiveness, it became a perfect mirror of everything that would eventually destroy the civilization that created it. But that is a story for another time. The point is this: the Webway existed. It was real. It was functional. It was the single greatest feat of engineering in the history of the galaxy. And somewhere, buried in the desert of what would one day become the Terran continent of Asia, was a door into it. Get Part 3, The Fall of the Elder and a Galaxy Left Broken. To understand the state of the Webway that the Emperor discovered, you need to understand what happened to the Eldar civilization and what that collapse did to the network they had spent millions of years building and maintaining. Because the Webway the Emperor found was not the Webway at its height. It was the Webway after the greatest psychic catastrophe in the history of the universe, and a catastrophe so total and so raw that its effects are still being felt 10,000 years after the events we're focused on here. The fall of the Eldar, or the fall as it is simply called in the lore, because when something is that significant, you can get away with not needing a more specific name, happened somewhere around the 29th or 30th millennium in Terran reckoning. It was the birth of a god. Not a metaphorical god, not a god of superstition and prayer, a literal entity of incredible and soul-devouring power, born screaming into existence within the psychic dimension of the warp, formed from the accumulated psychic weight of millennia of Eldar decadence and excess and transgression. The Eldar civilization, at its height, was astonishing. Billions of souls with a natural and deep connection to the warp, who had spent millions of years developing that connection into a form of existence that was rich and complex and, in its later stages, utterly divorced from anything resembling discipline or restraint. As they abandoned the ancient wisdom and craft traditions that had kept their psychic nature in balance, as the pleasure cult spread and the excess of sensation became the organizing principle of their civilization, the psychic energy bleeding from their collective experience into the warp grew and grew and grew. Something was forming in there, something made of the deepest and most intense flavors of Eldar experience, as something shaped like longing and hunger and the ache of sensation pushed past its natural limits. The Eldar who could perceive the warp could feel it growing, could sense its shape the way you might sense a storm on the horizon. Some of them fled. The Exodites took their ships to distant worlds far from the heart of civilization, determined to live simply and quietly and hope that whatever was coming would not follow them. Others, the Craftworld Eldar, boarded the vast city ships and retreated into the relative safety of real space. The Dark Eldar retreated into the Webway itself, into Komorra, believing that the dimension between dimensions would shield them from what was about to be born. And then it happened. In a moment, or across a period of time so compressed that the distinction hardly matters, the emergent entity achieved something like consciousness and screamed its way into existence. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, a she who thirsts, the fourth chaos god, and in some respects the one most intimately tied to a single specific species in a way that the others are not. The soul scream of Slaanesh's birth tore across the elder civilization like a wave that moves at the speed of thought. Those elder who were not already sheltered, not already aboard their craft-world ships, not already deep in the Webway, not already far out on the galactic fringe, simply died. Simply that their souls were pulled from their bodies and devoured, the entire spiritual essence of millions of beings, consumed in what must have seemed, to whatever cosmic perspective could perceive it, like a single tremendous meal. The Eye of Terror was the physical scar this event left on real space. A vast region of space where the warp had essentially broken through into the material universe, a wound in the fabric of reality that would never fully close and would spend the next 10,000 years serving as the primary highway for chaos invasions of the galaxy. And the Webway was shattered. Not destroyed, not completely. The network was too vast, too well constructed, too deeply woven into the fabric of that in-between dimension to simply collapse entirely. But the wave of psychic energy that came with Slaanesh's birth tore through countless corridors and passages, rupturing their walls, contaminating sealed sections, opening breaches through which the denizens of the warp could now pour. Whole sections of the network that had been safe, stable, well-maintained, were suddenly compromised. Passages that had connected Eldar worlds were now flooded with things that had no right to be in there. Dead ends appeared where there had been thoroughfares. Labyrinthine deviations opened up where before there had been clean, direct routes. The Eldar who survived did their best to seal off the worst of it. They used powerful psychic wards and the reality-defying properties of Wraithbone to close the most compromised sections, cutting off infected passages from the rest of the network the way a doctor might amputate a limb to save the body. They preserved what they could. They maintained what they could maintain. But the Webway of the 30th millennium was a pale shadow of what it had been at its height. A fractured, a partially collapsed version of a galaxy-spanning network that had once been the greatest achievement of any civilization that had ever lived. This was the Webway that waited beneath the desert of Asia. This was the door that the Emperor found. What he saw when he looked at it, what he understood about what it meant, and what it could be made to mean, was something that required both the wisdom of a being who had been alive for tens of thousands of years and the specific, a particular understanding of someone who had spent most of those years watching the relationship between humanity and the warp, slowly, quietly becoming more dangerous with every passing century. He saw both what it was and what it could be made to be, and the vision that formed in his mind in that moment was extraordinary. Part 4. The Emperor's Discovery Beneath the Desert. The date of the Emperor's discovery of the Webway portal is not recorded with any precision in the canonical sources. What we know is that it happened during the Unification Wars, in the period when the Emperor was still in the process of forcing the feuding warlords and petty tyrants of a devastated Terra to bend the knee before his vision of a reunified human species. This was before the Imperial Palace existed, before the Primarchs were created, before the Great Crusade had even been conceived of in its final form. The continent of Asia, a huge and inhospitable desert, the texts say. On whether this is the Gobi, or what used to be the Aral Sea Basin, or somewhere else entirely, is one of those delightful ambiguities the lore tends to maintain about the geography of ancient Terra. What is certain is that something was buried there, something deeply, deliberately buried, as if whoever left it wanted to make sure it wasn't found casually, but could still be found by someone who knew what to look for and had the specific combination of intelligence and psychic sensitivity required to recognize it for what it was. What he found was not a door in the conventional sense. It was the core of a psychic amplification device, an artifact from the dark age of technology, the period of human history during which humanity had achieved its greatest technological heights before the catastrophic collapse that ushered in the Age of Strife. There is ambiguity even here, actually. In the conversation he has with the custodian Diocletian Koros in the novel Master of Mankind, the Emperor is characteristically evasive about where the technology actually came from. He says he either improved on something from the Dark Age or possibly developed the idea independently, yet he declines to be more specific. He is, as always, not telling anyone more than he has decided they need to know. The device itself was essentially a key shaped to fit a lock that had been built 60 million years ago by beings who had no concept of what humanity was or what it would become. The psychic resonance of the device was keyed to something in the dimensional membrane, to one of the Webway portals that the old ones had established across the galaxy, likely in the days when Terra was being seeded with life and watched over from a comfortable distance. Whether the old ones specifically placed this key on Terra for a reason, or whether it was simply left there as part of some broader infrastructure, is not recorded. What the Emperor found, when he understood what he was holding, was something that most humans would not have been able to even imagine properly. He found a gate to a dimension beyond the warp's reach, and he found a back door into the galaxy's own immune system. He found the possibility of everything he had been working toward for tens of thousands of years, made suddenly achievable in a way it had not been before. Here is the thing you need to understand about the Emperor's long game, the thing that gives the entire arc of his life and his ambitions their genuine weight and tragedy. The Emperor was not simply interested in building an empire. The Imperium was never the point. The Imperium was a tool, a necessary stage, perhaps, in a much longer process, but never the destination. What the Emperor actually cared about, what drove him across tens of thousands of years of careful manipulation and outright action and terrible sacrifice, was the long-term survival and flourishing of humanity as a species. Not survival in the short term. Not survival at the cost of everything worth surviving for. Genuine flourishing. A humanity that was no longer prey to the warp and the things that lived within it. A humanity that had evolved, psychically and spiritually, into something that could stand as an equal to the powers that had been eating at the edges of human civilization for as long as civilization had existed. The problem, the deep and terrible problem that had been gnawing at the foundations of everything he was trying to build, was the warp. Every psyker was a door. In every time a human being used psychic power, they were drawing on a dimension full of entities that would love nothing more than to reach through them and into reality. The chaos gods were fed by human emotion and human suffering. The more psychically active humanity became, and it was becoming more psychically active with every generation, driven by some deep evolutionary pressure whose origins were hotly debated, the more it fed the things that wanted to consume it. The Eldar were the cautionary tale. They had been a species even more naturally psychic than humans, and they had let that nature lead them to the birth of a god that ate most of them in a single moment. Humanity was on a similar trajectory, slower, perhaps, less intensely focused, but moving in the same direction, toward a moment when the accumulated psychic weight of billions of human minds might do something irreversible and terrible. There are those in the lore, notably the figure of Erda, that described as one of the Emperor's oldest companions, who suggest that the Emperor's goal was not merely to prevent humanity from following the Eldar's path, but to actively accelerate the transformation that humanity needed to undergo. To speed up the process by which humanity might evolve into a fully psychic species, managed and guided and protected, arriving at that destination in tens of thousands of years rather than the millions it might take naturally. This acceleration was the entire point, and the Webway was how he planned to create the safe container in which it could happen. The Emperor had been trying to solve this problem for a long time. Various approaches, various strategies, none of them individually were sufficient. But when he looked at that device buried under the desert, when he understood what it opened the door to, he suddenly saw how the pieces might fit together. Not a single solution, a sequence. A plan that would take centuries to execute and would require absolute secrecy and would probably require sacrifices that he preferred not to think about too carefully, but a plan that could actually work. Step 1. Complete the Great Crusade. Reunite humanity under one banner, one government, one set of laws. Remove the internal fractures that made the species vulnerable to outside pressure and internal corruption. Step 2. The Webway. Use the device he had found, being together with the extraordinary psychic amplification technology he could build around it, to punch a hole through to the Webway network and begin, patiently and methodically, the process of extending that network so that it served humanity instead of the Eldar. Build an alternative to the warp. Build a highway through the stars that bypass the terrible dimension and its hungry residents entirely. This extension would not be quick or easy. The human-built sections would be different from the Eldar-built originals. They couldn't be constructed from the same psychically resistant material the Eldar used, because humanity didn't have the technology to produce it. The Emperor's own psychic will, channeled through the Golden Throne device, would be the protection. But it would work, it would hold, and section by section, year by year, it would grow. Step 3. The destination. At the actual point of everything, once humanity was safely enclosed within the Webway's psychic shielding, guide their evolution. Shepherd the species through the next stage of its development. Not suppress their psychic potential, but protect it as it grew, nurturing it into something that could be expressed fully without feeding the darkness. Eventually, in the time frame of centuries or millennia rather than millions of years, emerge on the other side as a fully psychic species, all mature enough and wise enough to exist alongside the warp without being consumed by it. To reach the kind of heights that even the Eldar at their greatest had never managed, because the Eldar had made that journey without the guidance of someone who understood the dangers from the very beginning. This was the plan. This was what the Emperor found in the desert and built an entire civilization around, as a prerequisite for the part of the story that was actually supposed to matter. He brought the device back. He gave it to the engineers and psychic artificers he trusted most, set them to work building the structure that would eventually be called the Golden Throne. The name has a kind of bitter irony to it in retrospect. A throne is a seat of power, a symbol of rulership and authority. What the Golden Throne was supposed to be was a portal opener, a machine for accessing the Webway, a tool for the construction of humanity's future home. As it was never supposed to be a prison, it was never supposed to be a life support system for a man who could no longer walk away from it. But the universe does not always cooperate with the intentions of those who build things in it. For the time being, he set the project aside and turned his attention to the work that had to come first. The bloody, endless, necessary work of the Great Crusade. Reunifying humanity. Bringing the scattered worlds back into contact with each other, as establishing the networks of communication and trade and law that would hold the Imperium together, fighting the aliens and the renegades and the warlords and the corrupted, building, brick by brick and world by world, the civilization that would be the foundation for the next stage. It took 2 centuries, 200 years of the most intensive military campaign in human history, led personally by a being of extraordinary power and extraordinary patience. And at the end of it, not the very end because the crusade was not quite finished, but far enough along that the outcome was not in serious doubt, the Emperor made his move. He left the crusade, he came home, and he walked down into the dungeons beneath his palace and sat down on the Golden Throne and began the great work in earnest. Asher's Part 5. The Great Work Begins. Building Heaven in Secret. The moment the Emperor left the Great Crusade was the moment the plan shifted from theory to execution. After the extraordinary victory at Ulanor.
I want to stop here for just a second because honestly this is the part of the lore that hooked me personally. Not the armies, not the Primarchs, not even the Horse Heresy itself. It was this, the Webway project. Because when you actually understand what was being built down there and you understand what broke it, and you understand that it was broken by someone trying to help, it stops feeling like fictional tragedy and starts feeling like something real, like something you recognize. The best laid plan undone by the one person who would have understood it most, if only he'd been trusted with it. That specific shape of failure, I don't think any other setting does it better, and I don't think it'll ever quite get over it. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The largest single engagement against an alien horde the Imperium had yet faced, fought against an orc empire that had grown to a size that threatened to overwhelm entire sectors of the galaxy, the Emperor made a decision that bewildered virtually everyone who knew him. He named Horus as War Master. He gave command of the ongoing Great Crusade to his most brilliant and beloved son, and he left, returned to Terra, back to the palace, back to the dungeons beneath the palace, where the Golden Throne waited, and beyond it, the Webway. The Primarchs were confused. Some were hurt. Horus himself, despite having just been given the greatest honor in the Imperium, felt the sting of it, felt that his father had decided the crusade could proceed without him, which was true, but which also implied that Horus and his brothers were sufficiently capable that the Emperor's personal attention was no longer needed. This was true, but it was also the kind of truth that people have complicated feelings about when it's pointed out by the person they're supposed to be grateful to. None of them were told why he was leaving. None of them were told about the project in the dungeons. Not Horus, not Rogel Dawn, not even Magnus. Who would have been the single most qualified person in the Imperium to assist, and who would have understood better than anyone the stakes involved and the care required? The Emperor kept it all secret. Why? He gave reasons to those he eventually trusted with partial knowledge. He worried about the Navy's nobilite, the navigator houses, the families of mutant humans whose ability to perceive the warp made them indispensable guides for interstellar travel. If those families understood that the Emperor was building something that would make them completely obsolete, they might act against the project. They had both the influence and the desperation to do genuine harm. So the secrecy, at least regarding the navigators, made a certain kind of sense. But not telling the Primarchs, not telling the custodians who were dying in those tunnels to protect the workers who built them. There the stated reason is less convincing. The Emperor simply said there were reasons and declined to elaborate fully. He was, as the Master of Mankind makes clear, not above telling partial truths when he felt the full truth was something people couldn't handle or didn't need to know. What was happening in those dungeons, in those years of secret work, was genuinely extraordinary. The Emperor created a new caste of Mechanicum Tech priests, designated the Unifiers. Their sole purpose was construction within the Webway, tens of thousands of them, working in conditions that were, to put it gently, not entirely safe. The Webway's original sections were built from psychically resistant material that naturally kept out the entities of the warp. But the new sections being built to extend the network, the sections connecting Terra to the abandoned Elder corridors beyond, were not built from that material. They couldn't be. Humanity didn't have the technology to replicate the ancient substance the Old Ones and the Elder had used. The Unifiers were working with the best materials humanity had, which were simply not up to the same standard. This was not a deal-breaker. The Emperor had a solution. He himself, sitting upon the Golden Throne, would provide the psychic shielding that the material couldn't. He would project his will through the artifact and into the new sections of Webway, as maintaining the psychic field that kept the warp from bleeding through the walls. As long as he was on the throne, the project was protected. The workers were safe. The tunnels held. This is crucial to understanding everything that follows. The Emperor had to be on the throne for the project to work. This was not a situation where he could delegate to a capable subordinate. The psychic power required to maintain the shielding was on a scale that only he could provide. He was both the director of the project and, in a very real sense, its single point of failure. Inside the Webway, things were proceeding. The Unifiers built their tunnels. The conduits extended, section by section, from Terra's dungeon outward, through the new human-built passages, and eventually connecting to the older, Eldar-built sections of the network beyond. They reached Kalistar, an abandoned Eldar city within the Webway, sitting empty and silent on its impossible plateaus, and its spires stretching toward a ceiling that implied a sky that wasn't there. The texts call it the impossible city, and the name captures something genuine about what it must have been like to step into it. An entire city, built in the space between dimensions, by a civilization that no longer existed. The custodians who entered the Webway as the project progressed were witnessing something genuinely alien. The tunnels varied enormously in scale. Some were barely larger than corridors, their walls shimmering with the psychic residue of their construction. Others opened into volumes so vast that the ceiling was invisible in the distance above, and the glowing walls curved away into something that might have been mistaken for a horizon. There were sections of the network that clearly hadn't been used in millennia, their surfaces covered in the residue of time and abandonment. There were other sections that felt oddly alive, as if the dimension itself were aware of their presence. The Sisters of Silence were there too, from the beginning. The Emperor's all-female order of psychic nulls, humans born with the rare and deeply unsettling quality of having no presence in the warp whatsoever, no soul echo, no psychic resonance, just a blank silence where their spiritual self should have been, were invaluable within the Webway. Their very existence was a kind of weapon against the warp and its entities, who found their proximity painful and disorientating in ways that were difficult to fully articulate. Where a psycho was a door and a regular human was a lamp, a null was a cold void, a thing that didn't fit, that disrupted the normal flow of psychic energy the way a stone disrupts the flow of water. Together, the Legio Custodes and the Silent Sisterhood and the Unifiers and the various Mechanicum support forces formed a small army within that in-between dimension, as working methodically and quietly while the rest of the Imperium knew nothing about what was happening beneath the Imperial Palace. The project was progressing, not quickly. The scale of what was being attempted made speed impossible, but steadily. The Emperor's vision was, slowly and carefully, beginning to take physical shape in the spaces between the stars. But there was a problem. There was always going to be a problem. Because the universe that Warhammer 40,000 describes does not permit anything good to happen in a clean and uncontested way. The Chaos Gods, whose very nature was antithetical to everything the Emperor was trying to build, were not oblivious to what he was doing. They could perceive the shape of his intentions in the currents of the warp, even if they couldn't necessarily see the specific details. They could feel the threat, and they were not passive observers. They began, as they always do, working through proxies, whispering in ears, cultivating resentments, nudging events in directions that served their purposes. And they had, in the gathering of extraordinary individuals that the Emperor had assembled around himself, an extraordinary number of potential instruments. There is something deeply worth dwelling on here, in the texture of those years of secret work. The Emperor on his throne, channeling psychic energy into the walls of a dimension most of the people he was trying to protect had never heard of. The Unifiers building their tunnels in silence, not knowing the full significance of what they were constructing, told only that it was important and secret, and that the Emperor himself had ordered it. The custodians standing guard in chambers of alien light, watching for threats they could barely describe to themselves. At the Sisters of Silence, moving through those corridors with the eerie quiet of their nature, their psychic blankness a balm against the faint pressure that was always there, always pressing from the other side of the walls. This was how the greatest civilizational project in human history was conducted, in the dark, in silence, by people who could not be told what they were really part of. There is a tragedy baked into this from the very beginning that feels like a structural inevitability, as if the secrecy itself was always going to be the thing that broke everything, rather than any specific mistake made within that framework of secrecy. You cannot sustain a project of this magnitude on the dedication of people who don't know why they're dedicated to it. You cannot build a cathedral and tell the masons only that they should place the stones where they're told and not ask questions. Eventually, someone asks a question at exactly the wrong moment. Part 6. The Council of Nicaea and the Hidden Reason. Of all the events leading up to the catastrophe, the one that gets discussed most often in terms of its consequences for the Great Crusade is the Council of Nicaea. The gathering held on the world of Nicaea was where the emperor ruled on the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions. The verdict was clear, firm, and far-reaching. The librarious orders of the various legions were to be disbanded. Psychers within the legions were forbidden from using their abilities in warfare. The official reason given was the danger of psychic corruption, the risk of chaos influence seeping into the legions through the psychic disciplines that many of the librarians practiced. But the Council of Nicaea is usually discussed in the context of Magnus the Red, who argued passionately for the continuation of psychic practice and whose entire subsequent trajectory, the defiance of the Council's ruling, the use of forbidden sorcery, the catastrophe that followed, is deeply tangled up in the perceived injustice of a verdict he felt was motivated by fear rather than wisdom. And that is a genuine and important part of the story. But there is another layer to the Council of Nicaea that becomes visible when you understand what was happening in the dungeons beneath the imperial palace. There are strong hints in the lore, and this is supported by at least one alternate telling of the history, that the Council of Nicaea was not primarily about the safety of the legions at all. The stated reasoning was real and not invented. Psychic corruption was genuinely a concern, and the dangers of uncontrolled warp practice were not imaginary. But the actual urgency behind the ruling, the real reason the Emperor forced the issue at that specific moment in that specific way, was the Webway project. The human-built sections of the Webway were vulnerable. The Emperor's psychic shielding maintained their integrity, but that shielding was not absolute. A sufficiently powerful and uncontrolled psychic activity in the material universe could still punch through the protective field in ways that would compromise the project. There had already been incidents. There had already been moments where the walls between the Webway's human-built corridors and the warp had thinned dangerously, not because of any enemy action, but simply because of the psychic resonance of powerful beings using powerful abilities nearby. The Emperor's ruling was, at its core, a protective measure for the project he couldn't tell anyone about. The fewer uncontrolled psychers throwing their power around, the lower the risk that someone would accidentally punch a hole in the work he was so carefully building. But because he couldn't explain this, couldn't say, "I need you to stop using psychic powers because it threatens my secret Webway project," without revealing the secret project, he had to give a reason that sounded convincing on its own merits. Yeah, and the danger of corruption was convincing on its own merits. It just wasn't the whole story. Magnus, of all people, would have understood if he'd been told. Magnus, who had spent decades studying the principles of psychic practice, who had thought more carefully about the relationship between human minds and the warp than probably any other being in the Imperium, would have grasped immediately why controlled. A careful psychic discipline was essential if the Webway was going to survive being extended through human-built corridors. He might even have had suggestions. He was, before the fall, exactly the kind of person the Emperor should have been confiding in. Instead, the Emperor kept the secret. Magnus left Nicaea feeling wronged and constrained and misunderstood, returned to Prospero, and began doing the thing that would eventually lead to the catastrophe. Not immediately, not right away. But the seeds of it were planted in that moment when the Emperor once again chose secrecy over trust. The irony is painful in a way that feels almost deliberately constructed. The person who would eventually damage the Webway project irreparably was the person who would have helped protect it most, if only. He had been trusted with the truth of why it needed protecting. The Chaos Gods, or at least the particular attention of Tzeentch, the great changer of ways, the architect of fate, it was most certainly noting all of these moving pieces. The Council of Nicaea, the resentment of Magnus, the growing estrangement between the Emperor and some of his sons as the War Master's authority was established, and the Emperor retreated further into his work. The political fractures and the whispered dissatisfactions. The way that Horus, brilliant and beloved and given great responsibility, was being quietly manipulated by forces who understood exactly which levers to pull to turn loyalty into something else. The plan was in motion, not the Emperor's plan. The other plan, the one that would break everything. Part 7. Magnus's folly. The day everything changed. In the years before the Horus heresy broke fully into open war, Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, son of the Emperor, scholar king, as perhaps the single most gifted psychic practitioner the human species had ever produced, had a vision. It came to him in meditation on Prospero, that world of scholars and knowledge seekers and carefully controlled psychic discipline that Magnus had built in defiance of the fear and the restrictions and the small-mindedness that surrounded him. He had been defying the Council of Nicaea quietly, as he had been defying expectations his entire life. Not with the aggressive declaration of heresy, but with the scholar's quiet assertion that the truth was too important to be governed by those who were afraid of it. And in his meditation, he saw the future, or a version of it. He saw Horus, his brother, his dear and brilliant brother, who had always seemed the most human of them all, who had always seemed the most worthy of the love and trust their father placed in him. He saw Horus being turned, corrupted, yet reaching out to the ruinous powers and being remade by them into something that would set the galaxy on fire. Magnus tried to reach Horus directly. He was too late. The corruption had already taken root, was already too deep to be reached by a voice the War Master didn't want to hear anymore. So Magnus made a decision that, looking at it with the clarity of hindsight, was one of those choices that was entirely understandable, completely wrong, and catastrophic in ways that far exceeded anything its maker could have anticipated. He decided to warn the Emperor. The normal method of long-range communication was astrotelepathy, the network of psychic messaging that the astropaths maintained across the Imperium's vast distances. But there was a warp storm between Prospero and Terra, a significant one, the kind that blocked astropathic communication entirely. Magnus's urgent message couldn't get through by conventional means. So Magnus used sorcery. He assembled the most powerful psychic practitioners in his entire legion, and together they created an astral projection on a scale that had probably never been attempted before. Ascending so powerful and so focused that it could punch through any storm, could cross any distance, could reach Terra directly, could reach the Emperor directly, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, and deliver the warning that Magnus was convinced could still save everything. There was a voice in the warp as Magnus's astral form blazed toward Terra through the Imperium. It offered him more power. It offered him the extra energy he needed to breach the defenses he could sense around the Imperial Palace, the extraordinary psychic shielding the Emperor had erected around himself and his work. Magnus, burning with urgency, needing to reach his father now before it was too late, accepted the offer without examining it carefully enough. The anonymous voice was, of course, not a helpful stranger. Magnus's projection punched through the psychic shielding around the Imperial Palace with force. It breached the wards. It reached the Emperor. The warning was delivered. Horus was a traitor. The civil war was coming. But in delivering that warning, in using that borrowed power to smash through the most carefully and precisely maintained psychic barrier in the Imperium, Magnus had done something that could not be undone. As the wards were connected to everything in the dungeons below the palace, they were connected to the psychic field protecting the human-built sections of the Webway. And as they shattered under the impact of Magnus's projection, the protective field collapsed. The walls of the Webway's human-built corridors, suddenly unshielded, suddenly stripped of the psychic protection that had kept them stable and sealed, began to fail. The warp pressed in from all sides, finding the weak, an unreinforced material of the human-built sections immediately yielding to its pressure. Rifts tore open, breaches appeared, and through those breaches, in their thousands, and then their tens of thousands, poured the denizens of the warp. The Emperor, in his throne room, felt what happened in the way that you might feel a building you're inside begin to collapse. The work of years, the careful, meticulous, endlessly sustained effort of maintaining that psychic shielding, gone, not damaged, gone. The wards were not things that could be partially breached and patched up. They had been maintained as an integrated system, and when Magnus smashed through them, he hadn't made a hole. He had made a ruin. The texts that describe the Emperor's reaction in that moment are careful not to assign specific emotions. The Emperor is not a figure who wears his heart easily, and the sources available are all written from outside his perspective. But what is recorded is that he immediately understood the full scope of what had happened. Not just that the Webway project was compromised, that came through clearly enough, but also the deeper implication that in this moment, the plan for humanity's long-term survival had been dealt a potentially fatal blow. That the possibility he had been protecting, working toward, sustaining through decades of secrecy and sacrifice, and had been shattered by the unintended consequence of an act of love from a son who had been trying to save him. Magnus didn't know about the Webway. Magnus had no idea what he was breaking when he broke through those wards. He was doing what the Emperor had consistently failed to trust him to do. He was bringing urgent information, trying to protect his father and his species from a disaster he could see coming, and in doing so, without any malice. Yet without any knowledge of what lay beyond those wards, he had done more damage to humanity's future than any enemy of the Emperor had managed up to that point. The breach in the Webway's human-built sections was designated Magnus's folly in the aftermath. Multiple warp rifts, tearing through the corridors the Unifiers had spent years building. The workers in those sections, when the breach occurred, many of them died immediately. The rest fled back toward the entrance, as toward the portal beneath the Imperial Palace, as the rifts disgorged their contents and the screaming started. The Emperor did two things simultaneously. He sent the custodians and the Sisters of Silence into the Webway to hold the breach, to push back the tide and buy time, and he sat down on the golden throne and did not get up again, because someone had to maintain the psychic connection to that shattered field, had to prevent the remaining stability from collapsing entirely. That had to keep the warp from simply flooding through the portal and into the Imperial Palace itself, and the only being with the power to do it was him. For a moment, that had no particular drama to it, that happened with the quiet finality of a door closing, the Emperor became a prisoner of his own project. Part 8. The War Within the Webway. The war that was fought in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, in the abandoned corridors of the Elder Webway, and the ruined human-built sections that connected them to Terra, was one of the most extraordinary conflicts in the history of Warhammer 40,000. And it is also one of the least known because it was fought in secret by a small group of extraordinary warriors, in a dimension that most human beings did not know existed. From the outside, from the perspective of the broader Imperium, or from the perspective of the Primarchs leading their legions across the galaxy, the Emperor had retreated to Terra and was no longer personally directing the war effort. That was all they knew. They didn't know about the tunnels. They didn't know about the custodians fighting and dying in a place that wasn't quite anywhere. They didn't know that the Emperor was sitting on a throne in his own dungeon, fighting a war that was invisible to anyone who wasn't already inside it. This invisibility is itself one of the most devastating aspects of the whole tragedy. The Horus Heresy is one of the most documented catastrophes in the setting's history. Thousands of novels and sourcebooks have traced its course across the galaxy, followed its key figures, explored its consequences. And running beneath all of that, literally beneath it, in the basement tunnels of the Imperial Palace and the alien corridors that connected those tunnels to a dimension most people didn't know existed, was a second war being fought at the same time by a small group of people who could not tell anyone about it. The Siege of Terra gets the poetry and the epic tragedy. The war in the Webway gets silence, because silence was what it required. The Legio Custode, the 10,000, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, and each one a warrior of extraordinary capability who had been personally shaped and tested and approved by the Emperor himself, were the primary defenders. Alongside them, the Silent Sisterhood, their psychic null nature making them weapons against the entities that poured through the rifts. And the Mechanicum workers, the Unifiers, those who could be pulled back from their construction duties and given weapons to fight with. To understand what those defenders were up against, you need to understand something about the nature of demonic incursion that is easy to state abstractly and genuinely, horrifying to sit with concretely. When a demon enters the material universe, it does so by exploiting a weakness, a psychic rift, a crack in the barrier between warp and reality, a moment of spiritual or emotional vulnerability in a living being, a place where the membrane is thin. Once through, a demon is bound by certain rules. It can be hurt. It can be driven back. If it is hurt badly enough, it is returned to the warp, where it must reconstitute itself before it can attempt to enter the material realm again. But the Webway was neither quite the material realm nor quite the warp. It occupied that liminal space, and the rifts that Magnus had opened in its walls were not the same as a standard demonic incursion. They were ongoing, structural failures in the barrier. They didn't close when a demon was driven back through them. They stayed open. And through those open rifts, the entities that came were not limited in the way a demon entering reality would normally be. They could come in waves. They could press through repeatedly. They could gather on the other side in numbers that a material world incursion would never permit, because the Webway's compromised corridors gave them a staging ground. The custodians established defensive lines. They created blockades across the widest tunnel junctions, key positions that they could hold against frontal assault, while simultaneously launching fast counterattacks to disrupt the gathering of enemy forces. Behind the lines, the remaining Mechanicum workers were doing their best to seal the individual rifts, not repairing the damage in any permanent sense, but patching, applying stopgaps, buying time. Picture what those years were actually like for the people fighting them. As custodians who had been trained since childhood to be the greatest warriors in the human species. Warriors who had stood in the Emperor's presence, who had seen things on the battlefield that would break ordinary soldiers, who were in every measurable way superhuman, standing watch in corridors that glowed faintly with contained warp energy, listening to the sounds of things pressing against walls that were not quite walls, and knowing that the line they were holding was the only thing between those things and the planet above them, and knowing that no one was coming to relieve them, and knowing that the Emperor, who would normally be the resource they fell back on when things became impossible, was in a different part of the same tunnels, sitting on a chair he couldn't leave. There was a city in the Webway's human-built section called Kalistar. The Imperium called it the Impossible City, and the name was earned. When a vast construction in that in-between dimension, built with materials that were not quite material, populated by artisans and workers and Mechanicum adepts who had spent years in a place that wasn't quite anywhere. Kalistar was not just a way station. It was proof of concept. Evidence that the human-built extension of the Webway could sustain not just transit, but habitation. Evidence that the plan could work. Kalistar fell during the war, and its fall was the moment when the defensive situation in the Webway stopped being desperate and became something worse. When the Archimandrite, the highest-ranking Mechanicum officer in the Webway complex, the man who had been leading the construction effort for years, was possessed by an entity that had been waiting for exactly that opportunity, the city didn't just fall militarily, it turned. That the weapons and systems and infrastructure that the defenders had built were suddenly in the hands of something that wanted them dead. The entire carefully constructed defensive architecture of Kalistar became a weapon pointed at the people who had built it. What they faced was relentless. The warp, once it has a crack in a barrier, does not rest. It does not tire. It does not accept defeat or retreat for strategic purposes. The entities that came through the rifts came in waves that simply never ended, because the warp is, by its nature, effectively infinite, and its inhabitants don't have the same relationship with loss that material beings do. A demon banished from the material realm is inconvenienced, not killed, and another comes to take its place. The war lasted 5 years. 5 years of constant fighting in that in-between dimension with no relief coming, and no reinforcements to spare from the rest of the Imperium, no end in sight. The custodians were reduced to a fraction of their number, not 90% casualties across 5 years. That number is accurate, but it doesn't capture what it actually meant. The 10,000 were arguably the finest individual warriors in the history of the human species. Each one of them represented decades of investment, of shaping and training and personal attention from the Emperor. Each loss was irreplaceable in a way that the loss of a Space Marine, for all that Space Marines were also extraordinary, was not. And they were dying by the hundreds. By the time the 5 years were up, 2 of the 3 commanding tribunes had been killed in action, leaving Endymion, who had been the junior of the 3 when the war began, in sole command by necessity. The situation inside was reflected in miniature in the broader galaxy. The Horus heresy had erupted in full. As the traitor legions were burning their way through the Imperium, heading for Terra, the Emperor was stuck on the Golden Throne, unable to leave without the portal collapsing, unable to personally lead the defense of the Empire he had spent so long building. Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest companion and most trusted advisor, was doing what he could to coordinate the Loyalist response, but the situation was dire by any honest assessment. And then things got worse in the Webway, and among the demonic entities that entered through Magnus's folly, there was one that was different. Not just more powerful than the standard entities, though it was certainly that. Not just more dangerous, though that was certainly true, but different in a way that the Emperor, from his throne, recognized immediately, and that caused him to convey urgent instructions to the custodians in the field. It was Drachnion, the echo of the first murder, the end of empires. As Part 9, Drachnion, the echo of the first murder. There is something uniquely terrifying about Drachnion that sets it apart from the other inhabitants of the warp who made their way into the Webway's damaged corridors. Most demons, even greater demons, even entities of considerable power and ancient malice, are, in some sense, comprehensible. They serve the chaos gods, or they embody aspects of emotion and desire that have crystallized into being. Or they are drawn by the psychic resonance of violence and suffering and faith and belief. They are, within the framework of Warhammer's cosmology, explicable. Drachnion is not. Drachnion predates the Chaos Gods as we know them. It was not born from the collective psychic weight of Eldar decadence, or from the war and rage and death of mortal conflict. It was born from something much older and much more specifically human. The first murder. The first time a human being deliberately, willfully, ended the life of another human being, before the word murder even existed, before the concept of law or consequence or the wrongness of such an act had formed in any human mind. The primal moment of one person looking at another person and choosing to make them cease to exist, and the howl of anguish and horror that the dying mind sent into the warp in that moment. That was what gave Drachnion its first breath. It is, in a very literal sense, built into humanity. It is the shadow of every subsequent murder, the resonance of every death at human hands, the weight of every act of deliberate human killing that has ever occurred since that first moment. It is intimately tied to humanity in a way that no other entity from the warp is, and this intimacy gives it a specific and terrible relationship with the Emperor himself. Because the Emperor's story, as glimpsed in Master of Mankind through the visions he shares with Endymion, as includes the moment that Drachnion was born. The Emperor was there, in whatever ancient human past he walked through in that first incarnation, in the time before history. He witnessed it. He may have been the one who knew the people involved. The entity that he encountered in the Webway was, in some sense, a shadow of his own history. A dark reflection of humanity's oldest sin. But the reason Drachnion is so specifically terrifying as an adversary for the Emperor and his forces in the Webway goes beyond raw power, though raw power is certainly part of it. What makes it especially dangerous is its nature as a concept given form. You cannot destroy a concept. You can defeat it, temporarily, in a specific manifestation. You can drive it back. You can, with sufficient ingenuity and sufficient sacrifice, contain it. Oh, but the thing that Drachnion represents, the capacity of human beings to kill one another with deliberate intent, will exist as long as human beings exist, and as long as any two of them can come into conflict. The demon is, effectively, immortal in a way that most warp entities are not. Most of them can be permanently destroyed if banished in the right way at the right moment. Drachenien cannot, because its source material is inexhaustible. And this is what the Emperor understood immediately upon perceiving that Drachenien had entered the Webway. The tactical implications were clear. This was not an entity that the custodians could simply fight and drive back and have done with. This was an entity that required a different solution entirely. And the Emperor, from his throne, knowing that he could not leave to deal with it himself without the portal collapsing, spent time. He barely had working out what that different solution would look like. Drachenien is also, from a practical combat perspective, almost impossible to destroy. Not because it is necessarily more powerful than the Emperor in a direct confrontation, but because of what it represents. It is bound to humanity. It exists as long as humans kill other humans, which is to say, it exists as long as humans exist. Which means that banishing it is at best temporary, and that seeking to end its existence permanently might require something more fundamental than killing it in battle. The entity is categorized in the lore as independent. It does not serve Khorne, despite the overlap in portfolio, and while it has relationships with the Chaos Gods, it is its own thing, owing allegiance to nothing but its own ancient nature. When the Emperor learned that Drachenien had entered the Webway, he issued immediate orders to the custodians and sisters to find and destroy it. They tried, they failed. Drachenien was not the kind of thing that conventional military engagement could resolve. It moved through the Webway's damaged corridors like a ghost, taking on hosts when it suited it, and abandoning them when they were no longer useful, always staying one step ahead of the defensive lines, always finding the edges where the protection was thinnest and the danger was greatest. When it possessed the Archimandrite, the Mechanicum commander leading the forces in Kalastar, the damage it did was devastating. A mechanical giant of Mechanicum construction, now directed by an entity of pure destructive malice, turned against the very forces it had been leading. The impossible city fell. The battle lines collapsed. The remaining Imperial forces were driven all the way back to the gateway itself, to the last line of defense before the Webway portal into Terra's dungeons, where the situation was, to use the technical term, catastrophic. There is something deeply poetic and deeply horrible about this specific sequence of events. The Archimandrite had been, by all accounts, a true believer in the work. The Mechanicum adepts who had committed to the Webway project were not there under compulsion. This was a sacred undertaking in Mechanicum terms, work at the bleeding edge of technology in a place no human machine priest had ever operated before. The Archimandrite was their leader, and he was possessed because he was there, because he had committed to the work, because his presence in that strange in-between place made him available to the entity that was hunting for exactly the right vessel. Good intentions, dedicated service, the most extraordinary work of his life. And at the end of it, his body became the instrument of a demon's assault on the very project he had given years to building. This is how the setting tends to work. At its most honest and most merciless, it is not enough to be brave and dedicated and technically skilled and fully committed. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 does not reward good intentions with good outcomes. It rewards them with context for tragedy. What followed required the Emperor to do something he had not been able to do since Magnus shattered the wards. He needed to leave the throne. And leaving the throne meant abandoning the psychic shielding that kept the portal stable, which meant that something else had to maintain it in his absence. The unspoken sanction was put into effect. 1,000 captured psychers were brought to the throne and sacrificed, their lives consumed to provide the raw psychic energy that would keep the portal closed for a single day without the Emperor's direct attention. 1,000 lives for one day of freedom. The mathematics of it sit uncomfortably in the mind. Part 10. The Emperor's Last Day of Freedom. The Emperor descended into the Webway as a burning dawn. This is not metaphorical. The sources describe it this way, as an illumination, a sudden brightening of those in-between corridors that had spent years in near darkness, lit only by the cold glow of the warp pressing against damaged walls and the flickering torches of the defenders. The Emperor blazed with golden psychic fire. And that fire was not simply power. It was the concentrated will and the furious grief and the desperate love of a being who had spent tens of thousands of years working towards something and had watched it be destroyed, and who was not going to let the destruction be complete. Think about what it must have meant for those surviving custodians and sisters of silence who had been fighting for 5 years without relief to see him appear. Rar Endymion and the handful of custodians who were still standing had been holding a line that was getting shorter every month. They had lost their city. They had lost most of their brothers. They had lost 2 of the 3 people in the chain of command above them. They had been sustaining a defensive effort that had no clear endpoint and no visible hope of reinforcement, in a place that most of the Imperium didn't know existed, marked for a cause that they had been told was essential but had never been given the full explanation for. And then their master arrived, not in the way a general arrives, remote and surrounded by staff officers and advisors. In the way that only he could arrive, personally, blazing, in the full expression of what he actually was. Not the politician, not the strategist, not the father of primarchs, the psychic star that had been walking among humanity since before recorded history. Finally, and for perhaps the last time in his current existence, operating without restraint. He channeled that fire into the structure of the Webway itself, burning through the demonic forces with a thoroughness that the exhausted custodians and sisters, after years of attritional warfare, could barely comprehend. The defenders who had been grinding themselves down to nothing in those tunnels were suddenly fighting alongside their master. And the effect was profound. Not just militarily, though the military effect was enormous, but psychologically. They had been holding a line that felt increasingly like a lost cause, and suddenly the cause was not lost. The Emperor called back the dead, or something like them. The texts are careful about this, maintaining the ambiguity about what exactly was happening. Psychic echoes, burning in the same golden fire. The forms of fallen custodians who had died in these tunnels over the preceding years. Some of the ghosts of space marines who had been betrayed at Istvan Far. And something else. A massive figure, described as a giant among giants. The 10th son of a dying empire, so briefly reborn in his father's light. Whether this was truly the spirit of Ferrus Manus, slain by his brother Fulgrim at the Dropsite massacre, or something else, is a question the authors wisely decline to answer definitively. There is an argument to be made that this moment, this brief, blazing intervention in the damaged corridors of a project that had already failed, is one of the most emotionally charged in all of Warhammer 40,000 fiction. The Emperor, who had kept his plans secret, who had maintained the distance that his nature and his methods demanded, who had allowed his sons to feel misunderstood and constrained and insufficiently trusted, came down into the dark personally, burning with everything he had, come to fight alongside the handful of warriors who had stayed at their posts in silence. It was, in its way, the most direct expression of care and solidarity that he could offer. Too late for the project. Maybe not too late for everything else. The demonic forces broke before this onslaught. They retreated. They scattered through the corridors. And then Drachnien appeared, because entities like Drachnien do not retreat. It appeared in a form that the Emperor recognized. A fur-wearing figure from the deepest past of human history. Someone from those ancient days when the world was young and the first sins were being committed. It said it was his end. The Emperor fought it, and the fight was one of those battles where physical victory is not the same as tactical victory. The Emperor could hurt Drachnien. He could force it to change form, could pressure it, could make it flee and reshape itself. But killing it in any permanent sense was not achievable in that moment, in those conditions, with the time he had. Because Drachnien is bound to humanity, and humanity had not ceased to commit murder, and the entity had all the time in the universe to regenerate from any wound inflicted on it. What the Emperor managed to do was something more cleverly desperate. He forced the entity into a particular form, a sword, carrying the shape of Drachnien's rage and malice in metal rather than flesh. And then, he called Endymion forward, his most faithful custodian, the last remaining tribune, the warrior who had spent 5 years leading a desperate defense in the name of a cause whose full significance he had only recently been told. The emperor did something that the text made clear was calculated and deliberate and terrible. He pushed the demon sword into Ra's body, and not through any vital organ. The emperor's surgical precision in this moment is remarkable, or perhaps horrifying, depending on your perspective. He bound Drachenyan to the living flesh of his most loyal soldier, and then he gave an order: run. Endymion turned and ran into the Webway, not retreating to terror, running further in, running away from the gate, away from the palace, away from everything he knew. With a demon of unimaginable malice locked inside his body like a letter sealed into an envelope. The emperor's plan was the only viable one available: put the most dangerous thing in the room as far away as possible from everything that mattered, in the care of the one person he trusted to not let it go. Buy time, create distance. This decision sits in the mind and refuses to be comfortable. Endymion was, in any objective measure, one of the finest human beings who had ever lived. Custodians are not simply warriors. They are individuals who have been shaped from childhood into exemplars of human potential, tested against impossible standards, and selected because they represent something genuinely extraordinary. Ra had led an impossible defense for 5 years and not failed. He had kept the line. He had made every decision that could be made correctly, and had still watched his brothers die and his city fall. And he had not broken, and he had not retreated, and he had kept fighting. And his reward for all of this was to be turned into a living prison for the worst thing in the galaxy, and told to run until there was no more running left to do. The emperor knew what he was doing to Ra. He was not uninformed about the cost of the order he was giving. The visions he had shared with Ra before the final battle were not simply tactical briefings. They were an acknowledgement, a trust extended. Too late to change the outcome, but not too late to be genuine. The emperor let Ra see something of who he was and what he had been trying to build, and why it had failed. And then he used Ra as the instrument of the only solution available to him. There is a version of this that could be read as monstrous. There is also a version that could be read as the act of someone who had no good options and chose the one that saved the most people at the cost he was willing to pay in his own soldiers' suffering. Both readings are probably correct, and the tension between them is exactly what makes the moment so powerful. Endymion was never seen again, not in any official canonical source. He simply ran and kept running. And where he ended up and what happened to him is one of the genuinely open wounds of the lore. Drachenyan was eventually extracted from his successor vessel, and that's the demon's sword that Abaddon the Despoiler carries in the 41st Millennium, the blade that can rend reality and devour souls, which is why some fans note that the Emperor's solution was brilliant in the short term and contributed to a problem that would echo for 10,000 years. With the demon neutralized, not destroyed, but removed and contained, the Emperor turned to the remaining demonic forces in the Webway. He burned them back. He pushed the line forward. And then, because the 1,000 psychers who had given their lives could not sustain the Golden Throne forever, and because the psychic fuel from that sacrifice was running low, he returned to the throne. The portal was sealed behind him, not permanently. Keeping it sealed was itself an ongoing act of will, but sealed, and in the sense that the demonic forces massing on the other side could not push through while he was there. The last of the custodians and sisters and the surviving forces retreated back into the Imperial Palace. The Webway's human-built sections were abandoned to whatever was left inside them. The great work was over, not completed, abandoned, left behind in the ruins of its own catastrophic failure, sealed off and buried under the palace, as with the Emperor sitting atop the seal like a keystone that, if removed, would let everything built above it collapse into the void below. Part 11.5, The Future That Was Supposed to Happen. This is the part of the story that does not get told often enough. Not the failure, not the aftermath, but the shape of what was supposed to be. What the Emperor had actually envisioned for humanity on the other side of the Webway project's completion. Because without understanding that, without genuinely sitting with the specific texture of what was supposed to happen, the tragedy of the failure stays abstract. It becomes just another story of plans going wrong in a dark future, where everything goes wrong. The horror becomes properly specific, properly devastating, only when you can see clearly what was being built and what was lost. The Emperor's three-step plan, the Great Crusade, reuniting humanity's scattered worlds. The Webway project, creating safe interstellar transit, independent of the warp, and then the guided psychic evolution of the human species into something better equipped to exist in the universe, was not just a political or military ambition. It was a biological and spiritual one. He was not trying to build an empire that could win wars more efficiently. He was trying to change what humanity was. As the key to understanding this is understanding what a psyker actually represents in the setting's cosmology. Psykers are not simply humans with unusual abilities. They are a transitional form, a sign that the human species is in the middle of evolving into something with a fundamentally different relationship with the warp and the broader spiritual reality of the universe. The proportion of psykers in the human population has been increasing over the millennia, slowly but measurably. And the species is drifting, generation by generation, in a direction that cannot be stopped and cannot be reversed, only guided or neglected. Without guidance, the emergence of psychic humanity into a universe where the warp is an active and hostile dimension is catastrophically dangerous. Every new psyker is a potential door. Every increase in the psychic saturation of the human species is an increase in the raw material available to entities that want to consume or corrupt human souls. The current Imperium's terror of psykers, the black ships, the soul binding, the constant culling of those who cannot be safely controlled, is the institutional response to this problem, but it is a defensive response. It slows the damage rather than addressing the root cause. What the Emperor was working toward was the actual solution. If the Webway project had succeeded, if humanity had achieved a mode of interstellar travel that required no warp interface, that generated no psychic resonance, that gave the Chaos Gods no purchase on human souls during the long journeys between stars, the emerging generation of psychically active humans could have been guided differently, not suppressed, not feared, shaped. The warp reflects the inner life of sentient beings. The Chaos Gods are powerful because the emotions they embody, desire, despair, change, violence, are universal and pervasive and uncontrolled. But that reflection is not a one-way relationship. It is not simply the case that the inner states of mortals generate the warp's character, and the warp's character is then fixed. The relationship is reciprocal, and it can be influenced. If the psychic humanity that was emerging could be guided toward emotional and spiritual states that did not feed the Chaos Gods, towards something that the lore hints at but carefully avoids defining too precisely, it's because the Emperor's long-term goals are deliberately kept somewhat ambiguous. The very nature of the warp itself could be changed, slowly, over generations, but changed. The Elder had a version of this plan once, in their own way. Before the fall, the most philosophical and spiritual among the ancient Elder were doing something similar, cultivating inner states, creating structures of meaning and experience that would generate different kinds of psychic resonance. Unless they failed, because the rest of their civilization was doing exactly the opposite with spectacular intensity, and the fall was the result of that failure. But the principle was not wrong. The idea was not impossible. It just required a civilization-wide commitment and a degree of patience that individual Elder couldn't sustain against the pull of sensation and excess. Humanity, newer and less individually powerful psychically, Bez had something the Elder had lacked, a potential guide with the patience of tens of thousands of years of personal history and the power to actually enforce a direction. The Emperor was not just a military conqueror or a political unifier. He was the intended shepherd of an evolutionary process that he had been preparing for since before most of his Primarchs were born. The Great Crusade in this reading was not the destination. It was the gathering of the flock before the real journey began. Let's imagine, concretely, what the galaxy might have looked like 1,000 years after a successful Webway project. The Astronomicon would still exist, but it would be a redundant system rather than a critical lifeline. Ships could travel via the Webway without navigating the warp's unpredictable tides, and the psychic energy that currently feeds the Astronomicon could be redirected. The 1,000 daily deaths would stop. Not because the Emperor freed himself from the throne voluntarily, though that too, but because the mechanism that required those deaths would no longer be the only way to keep the lights on. The black ships would still exist, but their purpose would be different. Not harvest ships collecting psychic individuals for soul binding or consumption, but something more like schools. Places where the emerging psychic capacity of the human species could be properly understood and properly developed. The terror that currently surrounds psychers in the Imperium, justified terror based on the real and terrible danger that uncontrolled psychic emergence poses in the current environment, would not disappear overnight. But it would have a different trajectory. It would be moving towards something rather than simply managing a crisis. The Chaos Gods would not be destroyed. Their existence is tied to the fundamental nature of consciousness and emotion in the universe. And that is not something that can be unilaterally abolished. But their power, the raw material of human psychic energy that feeds them, the constant churning flood of fear and despair and violence that the current Imperium generates in quantities that the dark gods feed on with something approaching contentment, would be diminished, would be changed in character, would be, over the centuries that the Emperor's guided evolution was intended to span, gradually reshaped into something that was less useful to entities that require suffering as fuel. This is speculative in the sense that the Emperor's long-term goals beyond the Webway project are not fully stated anywhere in the canon. But it is informed speculation, and the shape of it is visible in the sources, if you look at what the Emperor was building and what he expected it to make possible. He was not trying to simply win the war against chaos, as he was trying to make the war unnecessary by changing the conditions that made it inevitable. And none of this happened. Instead, the psychic evolution of humanity continues in the most dangerous possible conditions, unsupervised, exploited, feared, and persecuted. The emerging psychers of every generation are either consumed to sustain a dying god, soul-bound into something that allows them to function, but constrains them from fully developing, or executed because the alternative is too dangerous. The 1,000 daily deaths go on, the black ships go on, the terror goes on. The Chaos Gods grow fat on the fear and suffering of a species that is changing in exactly the wrong environment, for that change to be anything other than catastrophic. What was found in the Webway was not just a transit network, and it was the first necessary step toward a future where humanity could exist in this universe, without the entire weight of the warp pressing against the door of every human soul. And the distance between that future and the one that actually materialized is the entire distance between 40,000 and hope. Part 11. The Golden Prison and What Was Lost. The Emperor remained on the Golden Throne through the Siege of Terror, through the final confrontation with Horus, through Malcador's brief and heroic and ultimately fatal substitution, the sigillite sitting on that device in his master's absence and burning away like a candle placed in a furnace, sustaining the seal through the sheer force of a will that was extraordinary but not quite equal to the task in the long run. Malcador died in that chair, reduced to ash and memory by the effort of holding closed a door that was never supposed to be this difficult to hold. When the Emperor's body was returned from the vengeful spirit, broken beyond anything that the apothecaries of the most advanced civilization in human history could repair, he was placed back on the throne. His last coherent communication was the dictation to Rogel Dawn of instructions for how to modify the Golden Throne into a life support system capable of sustaining the remnant of his biology in an undying state between true life and true death. Vulcan, during the siege, Ea had installed the talisman of 7 hammers, a device built into the palace's foundations that serves as the most extreme contingency in the Imperium's defensive architecture. It is, simply, a dead man's switch. Should the Emperor's hold on the throne finally fail, should the portal beneath it finally breach, the talisman will trigger a self-destruction sequence that will obliterate not just the Imperial Palace, but Terra itself. But the logic is straightforward, even if the scale is breathtaking. If the throne fails, the portal opens completely, and Terra becomes a second eye of terror, with the birthplace of the human species at its center. Better the entire planet gone than that. This is the device beneath the most sacred ground in the Imperium. This is what sits under the prayers of the faithful and the feet of the pilgrims and the deliberations of the High Lords. A bomb that will kill everything if the dead god on the chair finally stops fighting. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has sat in that position, sustaining the seal, directing the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes interstellar navigation possible for Imperial ships, soul-binding psychers, giving them enough spiritual structure to exist in the material universe without becoming doors for the warp, battling the chaos gods in the psychic dimension, and keeping their influence from flooding through in ways that would make the Imperium's current dire situation look comfortable. All of this simultaneously, while every day he is sustained by the deaths of approximately 1,000 psychers whose souls he consumes like fuel. The number is worth sitting with: 1,000 psychers a day, 365,000 a year, 3.5 billion over 10,000 years, give or take rounding errors. 3.5 billion human beings, made each of them with some degree of psychic ability, and therefore some degree of potential for something more, consumed to keep the machinery of the Imperium running, consumed to keep the door shut. Every single one of those 3.5 billion deaths is a consequence of Magnus's folly, of the wards being broken, of the Webway project failing. If the project had succeeded, the Emperor would not have needed to sit on the throne. He would have been free, whereas the warp portal would have been properly sealed, or converted into something that didn't require his personal maintenance, or bypassed entirely. The 10,000 psychers a day who currently feed the Astronomicon would have had no need to feed it, because the Webway would have made the Astronomicon's navigation function redundant. The Webway was supposed to be humanity's salvation from exactly this kind of horror. Instead, its failure created the machinery of exactly this kind of horror. Well, what was found in the Webway, what the Emperor discovered and understood and began to build toward, was a future where humanity did not depend on the warp for anything, where the daily consumption of human souls to keep the lights of civilization on was not necessary, where the relationship between humanity and the dark gods could be severed cleanly, permanently, in a way that deprived those gods of the fuel that made them powerful in the first place. What was lost when the wards were broken was not just a construction project. It was the most serious attempt ever made to address the root cause of the galaxy's ongoing catastrophe. Not the symptoms, not the demonic incursions and the chaos space marines and the corruption and the civil wars and all of the daily grinding horror of the 41st millennium. The root cause. The dependency on a dimension that was hostile to human life and actively being weaponized by entities who wanted humanity dead or corrupted or consumed, the Imperium of the 41st millennium, is in many ways defined by what the Webway project would have fixed. The institutional terror of psychers is a direct consequence of their danger, which is a direct consequence of the warp connection, which is what the Webway would have eventually severed. The terrifying, fragile, a constantly imperiled nature of interstellar communication and travel is a consequence of the warp's unpredictability, which is what the Webway would have replaced. The need for the Astronomicon, which requires the deaths of thousands of souls a day, is a consequence of that same reliance. The entire architecture of the grim, dark future, all of its horror, all of its oppression, all of its sacrifice and suffering and futility, has its roots, at least in part, in the failure of a project that came so close to succeeding that the distance between success and failure can be measured in the moment it took Magnus to accept a whispered offer of power in the warp and use it to breach a wall he didn't know was there. Part 12. The legacy, the consequences, and what it all means. There is a terrible elegance to the shape of the disaster. That is something the Warhammer 40,000 setting does better than almost any other fictional universe. It constructs its tragedies from the best intentions and the best people. From love misdirected and trust withheld and well-meaning decisions made without full information by beings who were, in every other respect, extraordinary. Magnus loved his father and wanted to save him. The Emperor loved humanity and wanted to protect it through secrecy when trust might have served better. The Chaos Gods loved nothing, but they understood leverage, and they understood that the best instrument for breaking something beautiful is someone who is trying, with all their heart, to protect it. The legacy of what happened in the Webway is not just historical, it is present. It is the current state of the galaxy. The Emperor sits in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, sustaining 3.5 billion deaths worth of accumulated consequence, fighting battles that no one else can see. That's maintaining a seal on a disaster that could swallow the world if he falters for a single moment. He has done this for 10,000 years. He will, presumably, continue to do it until he cannot, at which point the talisman of 7 hammers will do what it was made to do, and whatever the Emperor was trying to protect will be protected in the only way that remains available. It is worth pausing to think about what 10,000 years on the Golden Throne actually means, not in abstract historical terms, but in immediate ones. The Emperor was, before the throne, someone who had lived an extraordinarily active existence. He walked, he traveled, he built things with his hands and his mind, he spoke to his sons and his companions, he fought battles personally, with weapons in hands that were attached to a body that could move. He experienced the world through senses that were directly engaged with it. While all of that ended in a single moment when the last cycle of the unspoken sanction was consumed and the throne took his weight and the door below remained closed. 10,000 years of that. 10,000 years of existing in a state that is neither full consciousness nor death. 10,000 years of maintaining the seal, fighting the warp battles that no one can see, keeping the machinery of the Astronomicon running, soul-binding the psychers who would otherwise become disasters. Sustaining the tether that keeps the warp from swallowing what is left of the human species whole. 10,000 years of existing as a function rather than a person. 10,000 years listening to the future. He was building Scream on the other side of a wall he never managed to finish. The Golden Throne is failing. This is established in the law. The device was not designed for this purpose. It was designed as a key, as a portal opener, as the machine that enabled the Webway project. As it was converted into a life support device in the final moments before the Emperor went into the slow dying that has lasted 10 millennia. The Mechanicus maintains it as best they can, but the technology involved is beyond their full comprehension, and the original design never anticipated this use. Parts are wearing out. The psycho sacrifices required to sustain it are increasing because the Emperor's body is requiring more energy to maintain, even as it slowly decays. Or the margin for error grows thinner with every year. In the 41st millennium, as the Great Rift tore the galaxy in two and plunged the Imperium into an era of crisis unlike anything seen since the heresy itself, the urgency around the Golden Throne's failing state became acute in ways it had not been before. The Adeptus Custodes, finally moving in numbers beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace for the first time in millennia, were in part responding to this urgency, seeking solutions, seeking allies, seeking anything that might help address the problem that everyone with knowledge of the situation knew was coming. The Great Rift is itself, at least in part, a consequence of the Webway project's failure. The warp has always been present and always been dangerous, but for 10,000 years, the Emperor's presence on the throne has acted as a stabilizing influence, keeping the boundary between warp and reality from completely disintegrating in the region around Terra. As his power wanes, as the throne fails by degrees, that stabilizing influence weakens. The rift is not simply an enemy attack, though Chaos agents certainly work to make it worse. It is also what happens when the patch that was always going to be inadequate finally starts to give way at the seams. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, the kin of the ancient Eldar civilization who survived the fall by retreating into Komorragh, the vast city within the Webway that was already established when Slaanesh was born, possess knowledge of the Webway that is unmatched by any living species. They built it, or rather, their ancestors built it, and the Drukhari have maintained their corner of it for tens of thousands of years. The Golden Throne is, at its core, a piece of technology designed to interface with the Webway. Eldar technology, or technology built to Eldar specifications. The Drukhari would know how to fix it, or at least how to approach fixing it, in a way that the Mechanicus cannot. There have been stories, in the most recent editions of the lore, hinting at exactly this kind of desperate and strange alliance being explored. Dark bargains struck in the cold places of the Webway. Knowledge traded for things that the Drukhari would find useful. And the irony that the most actively malicious species in the galaxy might end up being the ones who keep the Emperor alive would be perfectly in keeping with how the setting tends to work. Consider for a moment the specific flavor of that irony. The Drukhari are not simply wicked in the way that the Chaos gods are wicked. They are survivors. Their entire civilization is built around survival, around the act of keeping themselves just barely on the right side of the spiritual debt they owe Slaanesh, who wants to consume every one of them, and will eventually, unless they keep feeding the beast with the suffering of others. The Drukhari steal lives and pain and hope from every species in the galaxy, not because they are irredeemably evil, though by most definitions that would not be an unfair characterization, but because the alternative is to stop existing. They are creatures who chose survival at a cost that makes every subsequent day a new negotiation with damnation. And these are the beings who may hold the technical knowledge to fix the machine that keeps humanity's God alive. These are the beings that the Imperium's most sacred institution, the Adeptus Custodes, may need to negotiate with in the cold spaces of a dimension that humanity was supposed to own and never quite managed to. The Webway was supposed to be humanity's highway between the stars. Instead, it is still mostly Eldar property, and the heirs of the civilization that built it are the only ones who truly understand how it works. And the price they charge for that understanding is the kind of price that reasonable people tend to reject until they are no longer in a position to be choosy. Robert Guilliman, returned from his timeless vigil in the stasis field, has spoken with the Emperor, but we do not know what was said. We know only that Guilliman left the conversation changed, and that the shape of what he learned has influenced his subsequent decisions in ways that suggest a knowledge of something larger at stake than simply the immediate political and military crises of the Imperium nihilus. Whether the Webway, whether the possibility of restarting something like the original project, or finding a different path toward its same goals, features in the Emperor's current thinking is not known for certain, but it would be strange if it didn't. The goal itself has not become less valid with the passage of 10,000 years. The need to eventually address the root cause of humanity's vulnerability to the warp has not diminished because the attempt failed. If anything, the failure and its consequences have demonstrated more clearly than anything else could have just how necessary it is to find some solution. What the Emperor found in the Webway was not just a door, it was a possibility, a direction, a version of humanity's future that was better in almost every measurable way than the one that actually materialized. A future without the 1,000 daily deaths, without the fragility of the Astronomicon, without the constant, grinding vulnerability to a dimension that hates everything humanity is. A future where the species could evolve, psychically and spiritually, into something genuinely capable of existing safely in the universe as it actually is. That possibility is not gone. It cannot be gone, because the Webway itself is still there. Damaged, yes. Partially collapsed, yes. Infested in sections and abandoned in others, but still structurally present throughout the galaxy. The technology exists. The knowledge exists, distributed across the minds of the Aeldari who are still alive, the Dark Eldar who maintained their corner of it, the harlequins who remember routes that everyone else has forgotten. The understanding of what needs to be done exists, or can be reconstructed. What is needed is the same thing that was needed 10,000 years ago: the will to attempt it, the patience to sustain it, and, crucially, a fatally missing the first time, the wisdom to trust the people who could help, rather than carrying the secret alone until secrecy itself becomes the instrument of catastrophe. There is a moment in Master of Mankind where the Emperor shares, through psychic vision, memories of his ancient past with Ra Endymion. Scenes from before the Unification Wars, from the time of humanity's earliest history, when he was walking among the first cities and understanding what humanity was and what it might become. Ra, experiencing these memories, understands something about his master that the official mythology of the Imperium would never permit. That beneath the God Emperor, beneath the golden armor and the terrible power and the incomprehensible scale of his plans, there is a man who has been fighting in one form or another, for the same cause for so long that the beginning of the fight is mythological. A man who found a door in the desert and understood what was on the other side of it, and spent the rest of his existence trying to get through it, and has been, for 10,000 years, sitting on the mechanism that could have opened it, unable to move, listening to the future he might have built, screaming on the other side of a wall he never managed to finish. But the grimdark future is not just dark because of the enemies outside the gates. It is dark because of the specific, measured, human-scale ways in which the best efforts of extraordinary people failed to become the thing they were trying to be. That is what the Webway story is, at its heart. Not a story about demons and psychic catastrophe and lost civilizations, though it is all of those things. It is a story about what it costs to keep a secret when the secret is everything. And about what happens when trust fails and love misdirects, and the space between what you intended and what you achieved turns out to be wider than any dimension in the Webway. What the Emperor found beneath the desert was a chance. The only chance, really, that humanity has ever had to genuinely escape the shadow of the warp rather than simply endure it. And what he built around that chance, and what he protected with his secrecy, and what Magnus broke with his love, and on what the custodians bled for without fully knowing why, and what the throne now barely contains. All of it is the shape of that chance, half realized, still hanging in the architecture of the setting, like a question that the universe has not yet decided to answer. In the 41st millennium, there is only war. But under the war, in the foundations, in the dungeons where the Golden Throne groans and fails and is sustained by sacrifice, the possibility of something better is still there, still waiting, still defined by the shape of the attempt to reach it. The Emperor knew what was in the Webway. He knew what it could be. He spent everything he had trying to build the future it represented. And maybe, if Gilliman is right, and if the Custodes find what they're looking for, and if the Dark Elder prove as useful as they might, and if the 1,000 other contingencies that the setting keeps carefully balanced at the edge of resolution finally tip one way or another, maybe what the Emperor found will still matter. What strikes me most, when I sit with this whole story and try to feel the weight of it properly, is the timescale. We talk about the Webway project as a historical event, something that happened during the Horus Heresy, something we can place on a timeline and mark as finished. But from the Emperor's perspective, if he has any experience of time in that state, it never finished. The project that he built, and that was destroyed, and that he sealed beneath himself, is still there, still damaged, still leaking in the places where the walls were never fully repaired, still occupied in some sections by entities that have had 10,000 uncontested years to make themselves comfortable. Every day that passes on the surface, every prayer offered to the God Emperor, every life given in his name, every battle fought under his light, is another day of that seal being maintained by a being who has not been able to move his own hands in 10,000 years. This is not a metaphor for anything. This is literally what is happening in the basement of the Imperium's most sacred location, right now, in the 41st millennium. while the High Lords argue politics and the Space Marines fight wars, and the faithful pray for the Emperor's blessing. Oh, the Emperor is in the room below, sitting in the machine he built to serve a completely different purpose, keeping closed the door that was supposed to be the beginning of something unprecedented and beautiful. And he cannot stop. He cannot step away for even a moment. He cannot rest. He cannot grieve. He cannot do anything except what he has been doing for 10,000 years. And maybe that is the most devastating thing of all. Not the failure, not the deaths, not the 3.5 billion souls consumed to keep the machinery running, but the fact that the being who built the whole thing has been sitting in the wreckage of it, unable to step away ever since the day it broke. The architect imprisoned in the ruins of the building, the dreamer locked inside the dream that went wrong and cannot be corrected from the inside. Maybe it will matter more than anything else. That's the story. That's the real story beneath the golden armor and the demonic hordes and the 10,000 years of a dead god sustaining a dying empire. And if you've stayed with it all the way to the end, you already understand something about why Warhammer 40,000 occupies a space that most fictional settings simply cannot reach. The grimdark isn't just atmosphere. It isn't just skulls on every surface and darkness for the sake of darkness. The darkness is load-bearing. It holds up a very specific kind of story. One where the tragedy is not that good people failed to try, but that good people tried with everything they had and failed anyway. And the machinery of that failure is still running 10,000 years later, still costing lives, still consuming the very things it was supposed to protect. What makes the Webway story work, in the deepest storytelling sense, is that there is no villain responsible for the catastrophe. The Chaos Gods wanted it to happen, and they manipulated conditions to make it more likely, but the actual breaking of the wards was done by Magnus, who loved his father. The secrecy that prevented Magnus from understanding what he was breaking was maintained by the Emperor, who loved humanity and believed he was protecting it. The entire catastrophe is constructed from love, from the most human of impulses, misdirected, operating without sufficient information, and landing on the worst possible outcome through the worst possible confluence of timing and circumstance. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with understanding this story properly. Not the grief of watching something bad happen to good people. That is a grief that most fiction can produce. But the grief of watching something good become the instrument of something terrible. The grief of watching trust withheld become the very mechanism of disaster. But the grief of a door that was supposed to open a future and instead sealed a prison, and of the man who held it open long enough to get through becoming the man who has sat on the other side of it, alone, for 10,000 years. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium prays to its emperor every day. It sacrifices in his name. It sends millions to die in wars that are fought, ultimately, to preserve an institution that exists because of his failure. Whilst it worships the outcome of the catastrophe, as if it were the intention. The faith of the Imperium is real. There is genuine power in it, genuine psychic resonance in those billions of prayers. But it is faith in a picture of the Emperor that he himself would probably not recognize. The God King on the golden throne, receiving the devotion of humanity, dispensing his protection through the armies and the institutions of the Imperium. That is what the faithful see. What is actually in the room below the Astronomicon is something more specific, more human, and more heartbreaking than any mythology. A man who built a door and had it broken, sitting on the mechanism that was supposed to open it, doing the only thing he can still do, which is keep the ruin from collapsing outward and taking everything with it. A man who has not moved in 10,000 years. A man who, in whatever form his consciousness still operates, he probably still knows exactly what the Webway was supposed to become, and exactly how far from that becoming it now is. That is the Emperor. That is what sits at the heart of the Imperium. And the question that the current era of the setting seems increasingly willing to ask openly, the question that Guilliman's return and the failing throne and the Great Rift and the Custodes moving beyond the palace walls all point toward, is whether any of what was originally intended can still be salvaged. Whether some version of the project that was buried under the failure can still be reached. Whether the door that Magnus broke open in all the wrong ways could, with sufficient ingenuity and sufficient courage and the wisdom to seek help from the right people this time, be properly opened after all. The answer the setting gives, at least for now, is maybe. And maybe is more than the Imperium has had in a very long time. As if this was the kind of deep dive into real Warhammer 40,000 lore that you've been looking for. If you want to understand not just what the setting looks like on the surface, but why it was built the way it was, what the darkness is actually made of, and what it means, then please do subscribe and leave a comment below. Comments are genuinely how the channel finds new people who care about this kind of storytelling. And if you want to let me know which thread from today deserves its own full exploration, drop that in the comments too. Magnus, the Red, and the full story of the Thousand Suns. The war in heaven, and what the Old Ones actually were. The real nature of the Citan, and what happened to them after the Necrons turned their gods against each other. The current state of the Webway in the 42nd Millennium, and what the Drukhari may actually know about repairing the Golden Throne. The nature of Draconian, and what Abaddon the Despoiler has done with the demon sword that carries it. Because that thread runs directly from Ra Endymion's desperate run into the dark, and it leads somewhere that deserves its own careful unraveling. There is always more to tell in the grim darkness of the far future. There is always one more layer of lore beneath the one you already know. And this channel exists precisely for those moments when you want to sit down, close your eyes, and let the story of the 41st Millennium wash over you properly. And the silence where the Webway should have been. The silence beneath the throne room. The silence of a highway between the stars that humanity was supposed to own and never quite reached, is the loudest thing in the whole setting, if you know how to listen for it. The Emperor protects, even when it costs everything he had and everything he was and everything he might have been.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.